Good morning, Moray Rabotai. We are continuing on Masechet Berachot, and we are holding on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Bet by two dots in the middle of the Amud. The learning of Amud Yomi has been dedicated for month of Av by Mr. and Mrs. Bayan Far for Fashil Ma'av, Shefa Bad Nehamam, and for the health and happiness of the children, Rafaela Miriam Bat Tzipora, Chana Bat Tzipora, Amuna Rachel Bat Tzipora, and Sophia Sarah Bat Tzipora. They shall much nachat from them. Amen. So we are in the middle of a discussion of the Machloket Rabbi Yehuda and Chachamim in the Gemara that basically discusses the halachot of Baal Keri, someone that had seminal emission, whether or not they are mutar to learn Torah, whether or not they could say a bracha, the Birkot Kriyat Shema that we discussed, that Rabbi Yehuda seems in the Mishnah to say, Mevarech lifnehem uleacharehem, that not only you're going to say Shema, unlike Chachamim, who say you think it in your mind, Behirhur, Rabbi Yehuda says not only you say Shema, but you also say the brachot of Kriyat Shema. This is how we understood originally when we learned the Mishnah. Today's discussion is going to be primarily about the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Is that understanding correct in Rabbi Yehuda, or is that understanding incorrect? And we're going to have three different ways of understanding Rabbi Yehuda. The Gemara tries one way, knocks it off another way, that doesn't work either. And then finally, we will have a final understanding of what Rabbi Yehuda exactly is referring to. But be that as it may, of course, this is about Takanat Ezra, that a Baal Keri should not be learning Torah. And with extension of that, perhaps the Tefillah also is questionable whether or not a person that's Baal Keri could daven the Birkot Kriyat Shema and so on, because of the extra Kedusha that the Torah has. And we will see soon that the Takanat Ezra is learned by Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi from a pasuk as well. So let's begin. The Gemara in the middle of the Amud by two dots says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mevarech lifnehem ulacharehem, which is the quotation of the Mishnah. Remember the Kasava Rabbi Yehuda Baal Keri mutar b'divrei Torah. Does he completely ignore Takanat Ezra? So we learned Takanat Ezra is a Gemara in Masechet Bava Kama on Daf Pei Bet 82. 10 different institutions, rabbinic institutions that Ezra Sofer made, and actually the last one, the 10th one, is that the Baal Keri is asur to learn Torah. So how can Rabbi Yehuda, who's a Tana, disagree with Takanat Ezra, which is the Takana of Revi'im? Are you suggesting that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold of Takanat Ezra? How can that be? You don't know that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi learns this concept from the Torah. Actually, this now becomes a question, because on one hand, you have Takanat Ezra, that is a rabbinic institution. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi suggests that this is something you learn actually from the Psukim in Devarim. So Rishonim grapple with this. What exactly is the nature of this Takanat Ezra? And you see, it was a biblical concept, and then perhaps Ezra Sofer added some twists to it for certain cases, which again, time allowing, we'll discuss in the end of the shiur. Says the Gemara, Veha Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi. Don't you know that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi learned this from the Psukim? Minayin leBaal Keri asur b'divrei Torah. How do we know that a Baal Keri cannot learn Torah? Shenemar, as it says, Vehodatam levanecha v'livnei vanecha. The pasuk says about learning Torah that you shall teach them levanecha v'livnei vanecha, to your children and to your children's children. This is a pasuk right prior. This is exactly, we had this in Parashat Vayetchanan, right prior to the accounts, the second account of Matan Torah. It says, be very careful not to forget. Be extremely careful. One of the only places in the Torah that says me'od. Be very vigilant not to forget what your eyes saw and what your ears heard on Har Sinai. Yom asher amata lifnei Hashem Elokecha bechorev. So the full pasuk is Rak yishamer lecha ushmor nafshecha pen tishkach et hadavarim asher ra'u einecha upen yasuru milevavecha kol yemei chayecha. You should not forget what you saw. And hoda'atam levanecha v'livnei banecha. You should teach them to your children and your children's children. What's the next pasuk? Next words, mamash, in the next pasuk. Yom asher amata lifnei Hashem Elokecha bechorev. The day that you stood in Har HaChorev, in Har Sinai, in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you accepted the Torah. So you see, the pasuk juxtaposes these two concepts of hoda'atam levanecha v'livnei banecha, you teaching the Torah to your kids, learning and teaching, and right away it says Yom asher amata lifnei Hashem, the day you stood in front of Hashem on Har Sinai. So what do we learn from this? Rabbi Shlomo Levi says, you know what you learn from Yom asher amata lifnei Hashem? Of course, Yom asher amata. We're talking about Matan Torah. You're talking about the day you stood in front of Hashem on Har Sinai. So why does it has to be said and juxtaposed to this? It's coming to teach you a halacha. What is the halacha that you learn from this? The halacha is, you remember Yom Asher Amata Lifnei Hashem Elokecha bechorev, the day you stood in front of Hashem on Har Sinai. What was special about that? Hashem had to prepare you for 3 days. Al tikishu el ha'isha. The entire point being, we don't want Baalei Keri. Now, for Baal Keri, regular Baal Keri, 1 day would be enough. The 3 days is only because of women. Because women, it takes them 3 days to get rid of the tum'ah of Baal Keri, because constantly they could have being polet shichvat zera, giving out the thing that was put in their body is still alive. The zera stays alive for 3 days. So therefore, until 3 days, they're still considered poletet shichvat zera, and they're called quote unquote Baal Keri. So therefore, says the Gemara, for that, the pasuk puts juxtaposition of Yom Asher Amata Lifnei Hashem Elokecha bechorev next to Hoda'atam levanecha v'livnei banecha. It's teaching you that the Baal Keri cannot learn Torah, just like by Har Sinai you couldn't have a Baal Keri. A Baal Keri cannot learn Torah either. Okay? So learn it from the pasuk. How can Rabbi Yehuda disagree with the drasha from the pasuk? It says the Gemara. And juxtaposes to it Yom Asher Amata Lifnei Hashem Elokecha bechorev, to teach you malehalan ba'alei keriin asurin, just like by Yom Asher Amata Lifnei Hashem Elokecha bechorev on Har Sinai, ba'alei keri would be asur, to be by Har Sinai learning Torah. Here also, v'hoda'atam levanecha v'livnei banecha, when you're recounting that story, not that you're standing by us, but you're teaching what you learned in us to your children, which means teaching Torah, learning Torah, recounting that also, af ba'alei keriin asurin. Afkan, even here, when you're teaching it, when you're learning it, ba'alei keri is the asurim to learn Torah. So you're stuck with this pasuk and the drasha. You know what's the best way out of it? What's the best way out of it? You have a juxtaposition of psukim. You can't get out. You're choked. The best way out of it is if you have knowledge of a shita of Tanaim that disagree with darshaning psukim. In other words, you have different ways of drasha. One of them is the juxtaposition of psukim. When it's obvious it's coming to teach you something, we say, okay, fine, it's coming to teach you something. But if you know that there's one of the Tanaim that disagrees with this and says we don't dash in psukim, we do not explain and learn halacha from juxtaposition of psukim, that would be gold, right? It would be super gold if you know that Tana that disagrees with Simuchim is none other than our own Rabbi Yehuda. So he says, Geschmack. Rabbi Yehuda does not dash in the psukim when they're juxtaposed. Doesn't dash in Simuchim. So you're asking me, how dare Rabbi Yehuda disagree with a drasha pasuk when it's juxtaposition? You know why? Because Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan smuchim. He doesn't care about juxtaposition. Great, right? Not so much. Listen to this. And if you want to say, it would have been amazing because it happens to be the very Tanah that we are discussing is the only one that doesn't darshan psukim in juxtaposition in simuchim. It would have been great, but there is one problem. And if you want to suggest Rabbi Yehuda lo darish smuchim, that Rabbi Yehuda is the one that does not darshan smuchim, v'ha'amar Rabbi Yosef. Don't you know what Rabbi Yosef explained about that? Yes, correct. Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan simuchim. But you know what the problem with that is? The problem is even Rabbi Yehuda, who does not darshan simuchim, it's only in Berachot Shemot, Vayikra, and Bamidbar. Even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that in Sefer Devarim, you do darshan simuchim. And this psukim that we just said is in Devarim, Perek Dalet. So, stuck. Now, the Gemara is going to go for, several lines to explain A, how do we see that Rabbi Yehuda elsewhere does not darshan smuchim? And B, how do we know that Rabbi Yehuda himself, by Devarim, agrees that we do darshan smuchim? You got to explain this. But then we're going to come back to this kasha because now we're still hanging, right? In other words, now we're still hanging. We don't know why in the world Rabbi Yehuda could disagree with this drasha of Baalei Keri. How in the world can Rabbi Yehuda say, no, let the Bakri say the brachot, let the Bakri say the Shema, no problem. How can he go against a drasha of the pasuk? We got to come back to that. But now we're going to open the large parentheses to just give a Shas-wide basic information of Rabbi Yehuda not explaining smuchim in elsewhere in other parts of the four chumashim, and he himself agrees that we do that by Chumash Devarim, by Deuteronomy. Says the Gemara. Yosef, even Rabbi Yehuda, who does not darshan smuchim b'kol Torah, b'mishneh Torah, in Mishneh Torah, in Dvarim, darish, he does agree that we do explain the drasha of smuchim, of the juxtaposition. Now, let's go through it. Rabbi Yehuda lo darish smuchim b'kol Torah kula. We know Rabbi Yehuda does not darshan smuchim b'kol Torah kula, in the entire Torah. U'b'mishneh Torah, darish. And in Mishneh Torah, he does do it. He is the Manda Amar that we don't darshan simuchim elsewhere. So now, let's go through it. The Kola Torah Kula Menalan the Lodarish. How do we know that in Berachot Shemot Vayikra Bamidbar he does not darshan simuchim juxtaposition? The Tanya we learned in the Braita. Ben Azai Omer. This is Rabbi Shimon Ben Azai, according to the simple Gemara in Masechet Ketuvot. He was the son-in-law of Rabbi Akiva. We know elsewhere the Gemara says that he was not married. The Tosafot there deal with the fact that he perhaps was married and then got divorced because he was, the Midrash actually says this, that he was so involved in learning that he felt it was not fair for his wife. She didn't have a real husband because he was always constantly learning. The Gemara says in Bechorot, Daf Nun Chet, that Berazai said about the other Chachamim of his generation. He says, Kol Chachmei Ador, all of the sages of his generation, in comparison to himself, are Klipat Hashum. They're like, he was so big, Berazai, that he compared everyone else to himself like a Klipat Hashum, like a shell of a garlic, which is very thin. Says all of them are Klipat Hashum chutz min hakereach, aside from Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva is a different story. But all of them, Berazai was a tremendous, tremendous personality. So Berazai says, Ne'emar mechashva lo techayeh. There's a pasuk in the Torah, in Shemot, that says, Mechashefa lo techayeh. What does that mean? You kill a witch. Now, Rashi says the reason that it's mentioned Mechashefa, which is female, is because most of the witches, they were, the people who delved into witchcraft and magic of that sort, you're a woman, but it applies to any. Even if you have a male mechashef, also you kill him. But says the Gemara, Nemar mechashfa lo tchayim, v'nemar kol shechevim be'ema mot yumat. So how does this work exactly? The pasuk says in Shemot, in Perek Chaf Bet, pasuk Yud Zayin, mechashfa lo techayeh. That's a whole pasuk, 3 words. Mechashfa lo techayeh. In the next pasuk, mamash, pasuk Yudchet, exactly the next pasuk, says, Kol shochev im be'ema mot yumat. If someone has intercourse with an animal, mot yumat, should be killed. So says the Gemara, we know that shochev im be'ema mot yumat means skila. You have 4 different capital punishments. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin has a machloket, which one is considered a higher level than which we paskin that skila, serefa, hereg, chenek. That's the level from hierarchy, from the more severe to the least. So skila is the highest level. So we know that shochev im be'ema, the mitat bedin that he gets is skila. So says the Gemara, Ben Azai darshined that a mechashfa also gets skila. How do I know? He doesn't say it in the Chumash. He just says, mechashfa lo techayeh. Maybe you should do chenek. Maybe you should do herek. Maybe you should do srefa. Maybe you do, how do you know? Says Ben Azai, no. You do skila because of smuchim. Because the pasuk juxtaposes this, which kol shochev im be'ema, and you learn from the juxtaposition of these 2 pasukim, the halacha, that the way you carry out the mitat bedin for a mechashfa is b'skila. Right? Who argues with him? Rabbi Yehuda. Amar le. Rabbi Yehuda says, goes to Ben Azai, says, hey, wait a second. That's not fair. You can't just paskin a halacha that you give skila to this woman. Okay, so she's a rasha. But how in the world do you know that you give a skila because of smuchim, just because they happen to be next to each other? You paskin a halacha? No, you can't do that. No, this is in Shemot. In Shemot. Yeah. So says the Gemara, first wide line. Rabbi Yehuda, just because it's juxtaposed next to each other, you're gonna give skila to this woman or man? You can't do that. We don't explain psukim like that to learn halachot, says Rabbi Yehuda. He says, I agree with you that it should be skila, but I learned it from a different thing. How does Rabbi Yehuda learn it? Ela. Of v'yideoni bichlal kol ha'mechashfim hayu. Now, kishuf has a lot of different hashlachot masya, has a lot of different venues, right? The 2 venues of it is ov and yideoni. Now, in the Rishonim, the earlier sources even, there are different descriptions of what ov is, what yideoni is. Rambam says it one way, but both of them basically are ways of connecting with the deceased, with the neshama of a dead, right? Ov is basically they would bring the neshama there in their presence and would put things under their armpit. And Rambam says that they would hear a voice from the ground. Others say that the voice would come from under the armpit. And Yideoni is basically they will put a certain known bone in their mouth, and that the voice would come from an open mouth of somebody else from this bone. Be that as it may. There are the 2 types of connection with the death, which the Torah has, of course, banned. The famous story of the Shaul at the end of his life, with trying to go to a Baalat Ov and make the bring down the neshama of Shemuel Hanavi to connect with him to see what to do. He was depressed. He was in trouble with Plishtim. This is exactly right before he was killed in the battle. Him and all his sons, basically, in the battle with Plishtim. So Ov and Yidoni are bichlal kol ha'mechashefim hayu. When it says mechashefa lo techayeh, it includes black magic, gray magic, all those magics. And that's true, actually. I'm not making that. and also includes Ov, Hideoni, all those things are included in Mechashva Lo Techayeh. But the Torah takes it out and says about them, Ov and Hideoni, Bichlal Kol Mechashvim Hayu. Ve'lama Yatzu, why does the Torah write a specific pasuk about Ov and Hideoni that you give them skila? You know why? Lehakish lahen, it's a hekesh. Another way of explaining the psukim in Torah is hekesh. To make a hekesh between Ov and Hideoni and the rest of the group of mechashvim, of people who are involved with sorcery and magic. Lomar lecha, to teach us, ma Ov Hideoni biskila, that just like Ov and Hideoni get skila, af mechashefa biskila. A regular mechashefa also gets skila. So Rabbi Yehuda basically says to Ben Azai, says, I agree with you that mechashefa gets skila, but not from where you learn it. That's not the way to learn. Just because they're next to each other, the psukim, you learn halacha. No. I learned it like a mensch. How? Because there is an anomaly in the pasuk that it says mechashefa, and then it tells you by one of the mechashvim how you kill them, and it's clearly coming to teach you what type of capital punishment they all get. Fine. So this is now we know that Rabbi Yehuda in the rest of Torah does not agree with darshaning smuchim. That we know so far, right? Now says the Gemara, Ube Mishneh Torah menala de darish. How do we know that in Mishneh Torah in Sefer Devarim he does darshin? Amen. The Tanya, says the Gemara, we learned in another Braita, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Nose Adam Anusat Aviv Umefutat Aviv. Rabbi Eliezer says a person could marry Anusat Aviv Umefutat Aviv. Imagine if Rahman al-Islam, a man raped a girl or tricked her into a relationship, a minor, convinced her to sleep with him, which is, that's mefutat aviv. A minor or minor is really honest, even an adult. So can now, years later, can this man's son marry that woman? Now, you'll say, well, no, because there is a halacha that if somebody was married to your father, you could never marry them, right? Even if they got divorced, even if the father passed or they got divorced, even if it was a one-day marriage, you can't marry them. It's Eshet Aviv. It's an explicit erva. How about Anusat Aviv? There was no marriage. They were together, honest, pitui, whatever you want to call it. Can you marry that woman? Says Rabbi Eliezer. Nose Adam Anusat Aviv. Yes, you can marry Anusat Aviv. Yes, you can marry Mefutat Aviv. How do I know? Also, the same goes with the reverse. A person could marry Anusat Beno and Mefutat Beno. If outside the boundaries of marriage, the son has had relations with somebody, the father could marry that person. Unlike Eshet Beno. If it would be married to your son, you'll never be able to marry that girl, right? Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda Oser B'Anusat Aviv U'Mefutat Aviv. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's Asur. Rabbi Yehuda says, absolutely not. You cannot marry Anusat Aviv, you cannot marry Mefutat Aviv, you cannot do it. Ve'amar Rav Gidel, Amar Rav, my Talmud Rabbi Yehuda. Where does Rabbi Yehuda get this from? Says the Gemara, Dichtiv, because the pasuk says, Lo yikach ish et eshet aviv. A man cannot marry the wife of his father, the woman that used to be a wife to his father at some point, not currently even. Velo yegale et kenaf aviv. And he should not reveal the kenaf of his father. Kenaf shara aviv, a corner, it means, but kanaf here means the nakedness that his father has seen should not be megale. He should not reveal. That means you cannot have relationships of even, it's not illicit. You want to marry this woman, it's asu. But says the Gemara, how in the world do you know that that's referring to anusat aviv and mefutat aviv? Where do you get that from? You pulled it out of your pocket. How do you know that lo yegale kenaf aviv is a reference to anusat aviv and mefutat aviv? Says the Gemara, no, it's not out of my pocket. It's actually learned from Smuchim. How do we know? Because the pasuk right beforehand, this is the first pasuk of a perek, right? The pasuk that we just learned is in Devarim perek Chaf Gimel, pasuk Aleph. Lo yikach ish et eshet aviv. You cannot marry the wife of your father. Velo yegale kenaf aviv. Whatever that means. Yegale kenaf aviv. So Rabbi Yehuda says, do you know how I know that lo yegale kenaf aviv is a reference to a relationship that your father has had outside the boundaries of marriage, which means anusa or mefuta? How do I know that? Because of the previous pasuk. What is the last pasuk in Perek Chaf Bet? Says the Gemara, the very last pasuk, pasuk Chaftet, in Perek Chaf Bet, which is the pasuk right prior to this pasuk that we just read, is in Parashat Anusa, Me'anes. Says, "V'natan ha'isha shochev imah ha'avia na'ara." If someone raped someone else's daughter, you have to pay a exorbitant fine to the father. Tamishim kesef ve'lo tiyeh le'isha tachat asher inah v'lo yichal shalachah kol yamot. Is the halacha of Anusa. So says Rabbi Yehuda, why does the pasuk, the Chumash, juxtaposes the parasha of Anusa to the parasha of not marrying your father's wife, and then lo yegale kenaf aviv, which is debatable what it means? Says Rabbi Yehuda has come to teach you that lo yegale kenaf aviv is a reference to anusat aviv and refutat aviv. I learned it from the juxtaposition, and note that this juxtaposition is the farthest juxtaposition you could have, because even though that they're next to each other, they're two different prakim, talking about completely two different sugyas. And yet, Rabbi Yehuda, who never dashins psukim, says, I learn halacha, I disagrees with Rabbi Eliezer based on the juxtaposition of the psukim. So you see from here that Rabbi Yehuda does darshin smuchim. Okay? So says the Gemara, Amri, it says in the Bet Midrash, yes, you're correct. Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishneh Torah Darish, he does darshin smuchim in Mishneh Torah in Devarim. So now, parenthesis is closed. We're back to our hanging in the air question. How in the world does Rabbi Yehuda disagree with Baal Keri saying Tefillah, Baal Keri saying Shema, Berachot Kriyat Shema, all those things? Isn't he also bound to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's drasha that Yom Asher Amata Lifnei Hashem Elokecha Bechorev, who is juxtaposed to Hodatam Levarecha V'Livnei V'Varecha, that when you learn Torah, you have to be tahor, you can't be a Baal Keri. On the world. Says the Gemara, last middle lines, right before the very wide lines. He does darshin simuchim, but he darshins something else from the simuchim. What does he learn from this simuchim? Le'idach Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Da'amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Kol hamelamed livnot Torah. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi has another drasha. Any person that teaches their son Torah, they're dedicated to passing the torch of Mesorah, of the Torah to their children, not to take responsibility to see to it that their children are learning. Hashem considers for him as though he himself was standing on Har Achorev, on Har Sinai, and accepted the Torah directly from Hashem. Because the whole point was, that they traditionally say, no itechem levadechem, Hashem did not make the covenant only with you, Hashem made it with all the generations. Et asher yeshno po, v'et asher enenu imanu hayom. Everyone was there. Everyone was there. How do you have everyone there? Okay, so traditionally speaking, we say the neshamot were there, and so on, right? But the simplest way is when you have a commitment of parents teaching it, to teach it to your children, that makes it as though you stood, all of you, on Har Sinai. By the way, take a look at the Ramban on these two psukim. They are some of the most fundamental words of Ramban on Humash. The Ramban basically says he disagrees with Rashi very vehemently, and he holds that this, the pasuk that we started with, Raki shamer lecha ushmor nafshecha me'od, pen tishkach, is a mitzvat aseh and a mitzvat lo taseh. Not just talking about something else, which Rashi says, beyond the scope of this talk right now, but it says it's a mitzvah aseh lo taseh, not to forget what you saw, and to speak it out to your children and to your grandchildren. Why? Because that's how you transmit the tradition of Torah and Har Sinai to the generations to come. Because says the Ramban, we don't believe in Torah because Moshe Rabbeinu did miracles. We believe in Torah because Hashem spoke to us directly. We're not impressed with miracles and magic work or magic looking work. We are impressed with, we believe in Torah only because we stood on Har Sinai and we heard Anochi Hashem Elokecha. We heard Hashem speaking to Moshe, saying, Moshe, go tell them this. We experience nevuah, every single Jew experienced nevuah of level of Moshe Rabbeinu. Panim el panim diber Hashem imachem mitoch ha'esh. And that's undeniable. Because you can't make up that Hashem spoke to 3 million people. You could make up Hashem spoke to me. How can you deny it? I maybe have a good best friend also who will play along with me. You could make that up. But 3 million people? And that's why it says, the Ran in Berachot also says the same thing as the Ramban, but this is some fundamental. So I understand that this Gemara is also referencing that. If you are committed to teach your children, that's the whole point. It's as if you stood on Har Sinai and you accepted yourself. That's another drasha of Rabbi Yehuda ben Levi that says the Gemara, Rabbi Yehuda is darshaning that. Yes, it's in the Devarim. Yes, Rabbi Yehuda is bound to teach something from the juxtaposition. But who says he has to teach? The Baal Keri is asur to learn. He could be teaching something else. You know what he teaches? This drasha, more of an agadic drasha, that if you are committed to teach your children, it's as if you accept it from us. Says the Gemara, second wide line. Tenan. Now we're still kind of like not clear about Rabbi Yehuda. So far we're saying that he's not dashing the whole Keri business, right? So let's clarify it a little bit more. Tenan, we learned in the Mishnah. A person that has a double level of tum'ah. Now, we have some levels of tum'ah that are tum'ah chamura. Zav is also emission, bodily emission of men, or zava could have a woman as well, that they could be zava gedolah, could be, a tum'ah that takes 7 days and has a process to get tahor from it. That's a zav. How about a zav that becomes a keri also afterwards? So you need to go to vilah. In other words, the takana of Ezra was only for a Baal Keri, right? If you want to learn Torah, or if she, Zava, wants to daven, a Zav could learn Torah. A Zava could say Tfilah of Shemona Esrei, no problem. How about a Zav that also became a Baal Keri? You say, well, it's Bichlal Matai Mare, he already has the higher level of Tumah, so what does a Tfilah do for him? Or do you say, no, because Keri has a Chumrah that Zav doesn't have? Namely that Keri is Asur to learn Torah and say Tfilah, and Zav, it's fine. Zav could say Tfilah, could learn Torah. So a Zav that becomes Keri, you should go do Tfilah and learn Torah. Same with Zava. A Zava that now has a Tum'ah of Shechvat Zera because it was with her husband, now is considered Keri. Should go do Tfilah, or maybe not. That's Machloket Tanaim. And surprisingly, here, Rav Yehuda says yes. So the Gemara says, well, wait a second. I found another Rav Yehuda that seems to shed some light on this sugya of ours. Tenan, we learned in the Mishnah, second white line. Zav Shra'a Keri, a Zav, which is a Tumah Chamura, a higher level of Tumah, that saw Keri, it became a Keri. The Nida, and a woman that's nida, amidst the days of her nida, that also became a keri by, releasing the shechvat zera that was in it. Hameshameshet v'ra'at adam, and a reverse case. And meshameshet, that means someone that was with her husband, and then after, which means that she became a keri now. And v'ra'at adam, she became nida afterwards. Right? So there are two. One is nida that became keri. The other one is a keri woman that became nida. Right? The only difference is the chronology of it. We'll see why it's significant. Srichin tevilah. Chachamim say they need tevilah. Rabbi Yehuda poter. Rabbi Yehuda says no, they are patur. What's the sevara, the logic behind the machloket? Chachamim hold, yes, much higher. That's correct. And that's why Rabbi Yehuda says is patur. So Chachamim say you should still go to Tevilah because, well, can Anida daven? Yeah, of course Nida could daven, right? Can a Zav learn Torah? Of course a Zav could learn Torah. Can a Keri learn Torah? Absolutely not. So a Zav that became a Keri, so Chachamim, go to do Tevilah, then at least you could learn Torah. A Nida that became a Keri, go do Tevilah, at least you could daven your morning Shemona Esrei. Rabbi Yehuda says no. If you can't become fully tahor, you can't even become a little tahor. That's what Rabbi Yehuda holds. So therefore it says pointless. Go do Tevilah for what? You have to wait until you could become completely tahor, then the Tevilah works. That's the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. Now, the Gemara surgically is going to take one halacha out of this in Shita Rabbi Yehuda. Listen to what the Gemara is going to do. At kal no patar Rabbi Yehuda ela bezav shra keri. Rabbi Yehuda only says you're patur because you have a higher level of tum'ah sitting on you. But it's clearly indicative, the Mishnah, that if you would be only a Baal Keri, what would Rabbi Yehuda tell you to do? Go to mikveh, go to do Tevilah in order to be able to learn. So you see that Rabbi Yehuda does hold of Tum'ah of Baal Keri, withholding you from learning and from davening. Until now, we said it seemed like Rabbi Yehuda doesn't care about this. So Baal Keri, just learn. Baal Keri, just daven. You see from here, says the Gemara, that had it not been because of the higher level of Tum'ah that's on you, Rabbi Yehuda does care about the Keri, the Tum'ah of Keri. That he can't daven, he can't learn with having Keri on you. Says the Gemara, because he only on a double Tum'ah of a Zav, that's a Keri, or a Nida, that's a Keri. That's where Rabbi Yehuda says you don't, the Tevilah doesn't work because you're not a Baal Tevilah. In the beginning, you're Tameh already. Avar Baal Keri Gereda, if you're only a Baal Keri, you're not a Zav, you're not a Nida, Mechayev. You see, Rabbi Yehuda would also agree that you have to go do Tevilah. And if you say that, no, if you want to be stubborn and say, no, it's not the proof, Rabbi Yehuda would probably say even for an only Baal Keri, even just alone, no Zav, no Nida, just Baal Keri, maybe also Rabbi Yehuda would say, don't do Tevilah. Who says? Says the Gemara, no, you cannot say that. If you want to say, by Baal Keri Gereda, Nabi Pata Rabbi Yehuda, V'hai Katani La, and V'hai the Kamafniki Bezav, the reason, meaning this is all part of what the Gemara says you cannot say. You can't say that we're talking about even a Baal Keri Gereda, only Baal Keri, and the reason that the Mishnah talks about a double Tum'ah of a Zav and a Keri, or Nida and a Keri, is only Lehodiacha Kochan Rabbanan, to come to teach you how strong Rabbanan is, that even though that you are Zav, even though that you are a Nida, you can still go and become Tahor a little bit to learn Torah. Maybe that's the reason that the Mishnah chose a case of double Tum'ah. But really, Rabbi Yehuda will tell you that even for a Baal Keri alone, you can't say that. Why? Because Ema Sefa. The third case is irrelevant according to that. The third case is the same case as the second, just the chronology is different. It's Nida that became Baal Keri versus a Baal Keri that became Nida. Who cares? If it's coming to teach me the koach of Chachamim, it's irrelevant, the chronology. The only reason that the chronology matters is because of Shitat Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda says, for a case that you were first a Keri and then became Nida, then in that case you do tefillah. The meikara lav bar tefillahu mechayev rabbanan hameshameshet v'rat adam. The meikara bar tefillah lo kol sheken ela lav Rabbi Yehuda. So it is Rabbi Yehuda v'davka katani, and it is talking davka hameshameshet v'rat nida ena slicha tefillah aval bar keri gereda mechayev. So we learn from here that Baal Keri alone is chayav to do tefillah. So here we're basically, it's a cliffhanger before we start tomorrow's Gemara, because we are literally smacking them. We said we just proved that Rabbi Yehuda actually cares about Baal Keri, and he holds a Baal Keri is asur to learn Torah. So we basically knocked out everything that we had said so far, and now we have to deal with our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees with Chachamim and holds what? You could say Shema. You could say even Berachot Kriyat Shema. Rabbi Yehuda holds a Baal Keri. How in the world our Mishnah says, Rabbi Yehuda says to you, don't do Hirhur, but you could say Shema even. You could even say Berachot Kriyat Shema. How in the world? That's where we're holding right now. But tomorrow we'll see how that's going to come to an end.